Welcome back to Jungian Anthology Radio. We have a bunch of programs I want to let you know about, and I'll try to make this as quick as possible. First, we have Beyond the Gates of Consciousness Dream Analysis in Clinical Practice, and that's an online webinar series for 3 sessions from September 12th to the 26th. Then there's the Jung in the Heartland Conference hosted by the C.G. Jung Society of St. Louis, and that is in the St. Louis area, October 3rd through 6th. Recovering the Dark Mother is an in-person program on Friday, October 25th at the Jung Institute. And finally, we have another online salon series, a closer look at Book 1 of Jung's Liber Novus. That's from October 26th through June 21st. So it's all online, except that the final session is in person in Chicago. Also, the videos of the past salon series are now available for purchase. All of that is at our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to Jung in the World. This is Patricia Martin and I'm your host. Today we have the pleasure of talking about the life and times of James Hillman, renowned Jungian analyst and author. James Hillman's work as a Jungian analyst, teacher, and author spans 5 decades. Hillman's books argued that the best clues for understanding the human mind lay in myth and imagination, not in the standard psychological or medical concepts that were popular at his time. He published over 19 books as well as volumes of essays. In 1964, his book, Suicide in the Soul, challenged therapists to view thoughts of death not as symptoms to be cured, but as the philosophical longings to be explored and understood. A later book, Revisioning Psychology, argued that psychology's narrow focus on pathology served only to amplify feelings of anxiety and depression. Hillman held distinguished lectureships at universities like Yale, Princeton, University of Chicago, and Syracuse, and his books have been translated into 20-some languages. Joining us is his biographer, Dick Russell, an award-winning author of 15 nonfiction books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers. In addition to his biographical trilogy about depth psychologist James Hillman, he has just published The Real RFK Jr.'s Trials of a Truth Warrior. A recipient of the Citizens Chevron Conservation Award, Russell is also the eclectic author of Climate and Crisis, Black Genius and American Experience, Eye of the Whale, and My Mysterious Son, a life-changing passage between schizophrenia and shamanism. Hello, Dick, and welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Good to be here today.
Well, I finished your most recent volume on James Hillman just yesterday, and I have to say it's very well researched, and it's a lot of work to write a biography. And now this is your second in what you plan on being a trilogy. So I wanted to ask you, what led you? You've written about so many different topics. What led you to want to write about James Hillman?
Well, it's an interesting story. And, I never set out to be his biographer. I'm not a psychologist. I'm an investigative journalist, and I've written widely about the environment and many other topics over the years. I've written 15 books now altogether, including with people as diverse from James Hillman as former Governor Jesse Ventura of Minnesota, who was a famous wrestler turned governor. So I wrote a number of books with him, which seems kind of a dichotomy, that how would I end up writing about James Hillman? So the short story is that in 1998, my extended family and I had discovered his writings, and I'd been a big fan of Jung. I'd read Memories, Dreams, Reflections when I was young, and many other of Jung's books. And in our 40s now, or 50s actually, we discovered James Hillman and read The Soul's Code and other of his works, and where we have discussion groups about this and just among ourselves. And one day I was in the kitchen of our house, and a young man piped up who'd grown up in the family and said, "Oh, my dad knows James Hillman. He sells him his organic vegetables in the market in Connecticut." So I got, so I said, "Really?" I said, "Wow." So I called my old friend Wayne, and he set up a lunch between James Hillman and myself. I sent Hillman a copy of my book, Black Genius and the American Experience, and he liked it. And so we had this meeting and discovered we had certain common interests. We'd both traveled widely in Africa when we were young. We both loved boxing, of all things, that big fans of Muhammad Ali, and I'd known Muhammad Ali. So anyway, a relationship began where he visited some the homes that I lived in with my family, and he was interested by the fact we lived communally and had for a long time, because community was very important to him. And then in 2004, the end of the year, his older sister was visiting in Connecticut, and she was a great storyteller. She was talking, telling these wonderful stories of growing up in Atlantic City. And I said, "Dad, James, you should really get some of her memories on tape while she's still with us," because she was older than he, and he was pushing 80 at that time. And so this gave him the idea to bring together all of his siblings who were still alive. There were 4, and as many of his kids as could come, and they would have this whole weekend of storytelling and film it at his home that summer. So in the course of that, a young filmmaker from my family came and did the filming, and I asked a lot of the questions as the investigative journalist, right? And then our wives began talking afterwards. Was he ever going to do a biography? And he thought that maybe I would be the one to do it. So he called me and we talked, and he said, "This would take years, And it did. So that was almost 20 years ago. And this was certainly not the only project that I worked on during this time. He wanted me to continue my writing on other subjects, which I did. And I intended to just write 1 volume. And now it's turned into 3, because it seemed like I write long-winded books anyway, and there was just an awful lot to say. So that's the short story.
Well, it was a big life that he lived.
Huge.
Huge. And he cast a large, shadow is a Jungian term that I guess I shouldn't invoke, but he really left his mark on Jungian thought. And I was also curious, Hillman wrote a lot of books himself, and he took pains to write about the soul.
Yes.
What it is, what it isn't, how it functions. What would you choose as a few of his ideas about the soul to share?
Yeah, well, there are a number of them. And of course, he differentiated a lot between soul and spirit. And he was a man who believed that the soul, it was important to dive deep, to look at what would be called complexes, I guess, and even the value of depression. He talked about that. He wrote a book called Suicide and the Soul when he was very young. Later, he wrote a book called The Soul's Code. The Soul's Code, which was his best-selling book, really dove into a fascinating idea that we choose our parents. The soul chooses the parents before we're born, and chooses the parents that will enable us to pursue our own destiny in interesting ways, such as Manolete, the bullfighter, hiding behind his mother's skirts because he knew that someday in his soul he was going to be fighting bulls in the ring, right? But James Hillman also, he defined soul this way, and I'm going to read just a short passage actually from him in the biography, where he says, "First, soul refers to the deepening of events into experiences. Second, the significance soul makes possible, whether in love or in religious concern, derives from its special relation with death. And third, by soul, I mean the imaginative possibility in our natures, the experiencing through reflective speculation, dream, image, and fantasy. That mode which recognizes all realities as primarily symbolic or metaphorical, which brings us to the fact that he was the founder of what's called archetypal psychology, which gets into, the mythology of the Greeks and the great Renaissance thinkers like Ficino, and symbols like astrology and mythology that are vitally important to the growth of the soul today as they were in ancient times. So I guess that's a summary of does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. And again, it doesn't surprise me that you had to write 2 large volumes on James Hillman, and now you're planning to write the third. So it's a complete trilogy, is because there's so much to say. For instance, he wrote a book with one of Jung's closest students, Maria Louise von Franz. She was Jung's collaborator and conciliary in some respects. And Hillman worked with her on a book on the typology of personality. And many people in the audience, if you're not aware that Jung's work was the original work on typology of personality, you may have taken the, Myers-Briggs test at one point, but really that's based on Jungian theory. And so I'm curious, how would you type James Hillman? Was he an introvert or an extrovert?
Yeah, that's a big question and a hard one to answer, because I think he was. I don't think he was really one or the other. I mean, certainly he grew up in this milieu in Atlantic City on the boardwalk, right, which was all extroversion. It was just, the high diving horse and all these the fantasy world that the Atlantic City boardwalk was in the 1920s. It was entertainment capital of the country, of the world, really. When he grew up in a hotel, his family were the managers of this marvelous hotel world there, and he met all of these amazing figures, adventurers like Richard Halliburton, who came to dinner, and Amelia Earhart. And so he certainly had a rich imagination sort of given to him on a silver platter, to in that sense. So there was a part of him that was very, he became an incredible speaker and teacher. So, those are very extroverted qualities. But at the same time, he valued the internal world so much. And later, I described some of this in the book, and I'm kind of jumping farther ahead. But when he was living when he left Zurich and moved to Dallas in the late 1970s, and we can kind of talk about that in sequence too, but he wanted to explore the soul of the city and what walking was all about. What does ceilings represent? I mean, he really dove into that with the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, which he helped found in the early 1980s. And so it was all, how we look. He talked about how our buildings are anorexic, for example, a fascinating idea, and was bringing together speakers who could formulate new ideas about that. I think he was both, depending. He went through a number of very difficult experiences in his life that sort of led him to his next steps as a psychologist or a psychological thinker. And so that's a fascinating thing too. The books kind of break down in an order. The first volume covers his relationship with Kate Kempe, who was this beautiful Swedish woman, and ends at the point where he's kicked out of the Jung Institute, actually, for having an affair with a student. And a huge turning point in his life that also enabled him to, he was gone as director of studies at that point, which Jung had appointed him to, while Jung was still alive in the early 60s, and he served in that capacity for 10 years at the Jung Institute in Zurich. But then when he was out, he got with Pat Berry and Rafael Lopez Pedraza, two remarkable figures in this post-Jungian world. He began what's called archetypal psychology, where they sat down together and formulated the fact that we have all these inner figures, and we're composed of a lot of myths inside of us, and a lot of different types inside of us, and archetypes that go back all the way to the Greeks. So that was the direction he went in. That was somewhat different than where Jung had taken depth psychology prior to that.
Well, your book, yes, we're talking today really more about that second volume. And it does open with a new relationship that he embarks on with a woman named Pat Berry, who we met at the Institute. You're right. Yes, she was a student there. But what I was curious about is he had been seeing Pat Berry for some time before the split with his wife, Kate. How did Hillman explain this to himself and to his family?
Well, he didn't for a long time. His relationship with Pat Berry was kept under wraps, even among close friends. And what was interesting was that the person who got him kicked out as director of studies at the Jung Institute was C.A. Meyer, who was Jung's sort of right-hand man, for a long time, and was very anti-Hillman, and was at the same time Hillman, the analyst for Kate, Hillman's first wife, and having an affair with her. So it was a rather hypocritical situation, you must, obviously, in that sense. And I write about that in volume 1 of the biography. And once he met Pat, of course, she was very different than Kate, and she was a working colleague. I mean, they did a lot of things together in the beginning of archetypal psychology, and had a wonderful. It was called Spring House. Okay, so we're in Zurich in the early 1970s, and there were all these young people coming, who were like hitchhiking around and looking for something and looking for Jung, really, and ended up in Zurich at the Jung Institute, and they formed this discussion group in the evenings called Spring House, and went into all of these esoteric ideas, which I write about in the book. The memory theater of Don Camillo and the Picatrix, this ancient medieval text, and they were resurrecting all of this and discussing and analyzing, and this dialogue going back and forth, everybody drinking wine and having a great time, but really taking on something brand new in the history of psychology. There's one story I really enjoy, which is Rafael Lopez Pedraza. He was kind of like a bull himself, and he was a wild man. He was from Cuba and Venezuela, and one night they were discussing Dionysus, the Greek god, and all of a sudden a drunk fell through the window of the room, and Raphael goes, "You see, we constellated." No, turned up.
Well, I think Hillman's story is full. Your biography of him is full of characters who really are themselves larger than life. So I was really taken with the photo that you have of him with Robert Bly, the poet, Joseph Campbell, who was the leading figure on mythology at the time. And, the poet Robert Bly, although he wasn't a trained Jungian, he was Jungian-esque. And I never had the pleasure of studying with him in the MFA program at Bennington College, but he had taught there for a while. And his legend lives on, 6 a.m. lectures, where he was the raconteur and, full of Jungian theory and fairy tales. And so that alliance between Robert Bly, Joseph Campbell, and Hillman, did that play any larger role in the trajectory, the arc, if you will, of Hillman's life?
Oh, yeah. Well, especially with Bly. I mean, they were very close friends, and they initiated, Bly had already started it, actually, but And I think it's a wonderful story. I devote 2 long chapters in the biography to this. It was called the Mytho-Poetic Men's Movement. And Bly had begun in the mid 1980s. Came out of what he called the Great Mother Conferences, and he got together with a young storyteller named Michael Mead, who was Irish, great raconteur, and he used fairy tale, and Bly used poetry, and then they brought in James Hillman as the erudite, intellectual to discuss the ideas as they went along, and they were a trio, and they would just riff back and forth, and in a room full of like 100 men who would come together for a week in the woods of Mendocino or Maine or Minnesota to just really go deep and use these unusual methods to discover more about themselves and about life. And the movement was really misconstrued by the big media, as things often are. And, it was portrayed as here were all these guys getting together, go off in the woods and, put down their women and dance and you'd get drunk and, hear drumming. And it was so not that to the point that so many stories of women saying when their husbands got at home, wow, what happened to this guy? He is a whole different person than he was, when he went off into the woods with you guys. And they used all kinds of things. They divided up into clans. They made masks together. They had, what they called conflict hour instead of, cocktail hour, where the Bly and Hillman and Mead would kind of go at each other about various ideas. And it was never, nothing, it was no violence or anything like that. But the conversations, they just went into incredible realms. They'd use a fairy tale like the Firebird. It was a Russian fairy folk tale, I believe. And they would just go through the story and they'd ask men where they found themselves in the story at different times. So it was really kind of a marvelous thing that went on for a number of years. And for Hillman, it was life-changing for himself. When he went into this realm, he didn't know anything about it, except he knew Robert Bly, who invited him, and then he met Michael Mead. And he was going through a divorce at that time, or the beginning of a separation from Pat Barry. He was ending his time at this amazing circle of scholars in Europe called Iranos that met every summer, that Jung had founded back in the early 1930s on Lake Maggiore in southern Switzerland. And there he got to know people like Adolf Portman and Henri Corbin, and they dove into amazing, difficult, deep subjects. But that was ending at that point. So his life was coming to a point where he really needed something new, and he discovered it in the men's group. So it gave him a great deal too, that he could put into his writing and his life.
I read some of your descriptions of Hillman as a lecturer, rapt attention, standing ovation. And so I'm guessing he had a very colorful teaching style. What can you tell us about James Hillman, the teacher?
There's some good stories. Well, one story, which I really love, is when he gave the Terry Lectures at Yale, which was a very prestigious annual talk that had been given by Jung, that had been given by many famous scholars over the years. And he was invited to do this, and it's where he formed what became his Pulitzer Prize-nominated book called Revisioning Psychology. And over the course of several days, he took up these different subjects, personifying, psychologizing, I forget them at this very moment, the others, and at the end of the lectures, he would be so exhausted that he would just lie down on the floor to take questions. and people,
it's quite an image, isn't it?
and people would come up to him, and Casey, remember, the philosopher who became a great friend of his and met him there at Yale, standing over him, asking a question when Hillman's lying there prone and looking, like he was so out of it. And then Hillman giving this amazing, response to what he asked him. So now in class with students, he would also he taught for a number of years at the Jung Institute and later in the University of Dallas, and he could be very let's say he didn't suffer fools gladly, and if he got asked a dumb question by a student, he would sometimes just rip that student. But he mellowed over the years. He didn't do that so much at all in his later years, but he was considered kind of tyrannical in a way, but in a positive way, forcing students to come up with something that was more real, more intelligent. And there's a great story about when he first met Michael Meade. He was giving this talk on, I think it was on revisioning, and Meade was attending the talk, and Hillman was the lecturer. And then suddenly he told Meade, he says, I'm really not feeling well today. Why don't you give the talk? And Meade had been meeting him and studying him, right? Meade was terrified. He got up there and actually gave up a lecture. And Hillman eventually came out of his room and walked out into the audience and stood there. And Michael Meade saw him out there, and he said, "Well, Dr. Hillman, would you please come up and finish off what I'm saying?" And Hillman said, "No, you're doing great. You come up with some new things that I didn't have before. You just keep going." And out of that, of course, they developed a tremendous friendship that lasted for many, many years into the men's movement.
So that brings me to the end of your book ends around 1986. But I'm curious if you could give us just a sneak peek into Hillman a decade later. So in 1997, at age 70, his book, The Soul's Code, is on the New York Times bestseller list, and he gets invited onto the Oprah show. That's a big deal for any writer. How did Hillman handle all of that public attention?
Well, I think he was ready for it. He began writing books that some people objected to because they didn't. Some people thought they didn't have the depth of his earlier work, which sometimes could be rather dense and difficult. But he began writing more for a general audience, and he did several of those books. The first one was about the business world. The second was which was called Kinds of Power. And then he did a book called The Soul's Code, which Oprah read and invited him on the show. And the book just immediately became the number one bestseller in the country. And Oprah could do that, right? And she loved the book. She loved the idea that I mentioned earlier of how, the acorn and the oak, how we choose our parents. And I used all these case histories of very interesting figures who grew into their soul code that was given to them at birth by various fascinating ways. And then he wrote a book called Force of Character, which now by this time he's living in Connecticut. He's married to his third wife, Margot McLean, the artist, younger than he. And they had a wonderful relationship that lasted from till the end of his life, and collaborated together on a book called Dream Animals, where Margot did the paintings and the drawings, and he did the text, which was all about how animals show up in our dreams. That came out in 1997, I believe. Then he wrote a book called The Force of Character, which was about growing old. And he was writing about things that it was very prescient. I mean, he wasn't even quite at the age where things he was writing about happened. But he wrote about the importance of eros in older life, and not a guidebook, a handbook really, but it just opened doors for people who were aging. And then at the end of his life, he wrote A Terrible Love of War, which was right when we had invaded Iraq in the early 2000s. And it's all about how we had to come to terms with war and how it has dominated culture since the beginning of time, and look at it not in the way that war is beautiful, but see war in a different way if we were ever to move beyond it. So all of these things I cover in volume 3, which is called Soul in the World. and by the way, is going to be published in a few months. It's done. It's both volume 2 and 3 are complete, and though my many years of labor of love on this are just about over, except for talking to people like you, which I'm enjoying.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, we'll have to have you back on the show when it lands, Dick. But I went, clicking around the web to find, lectures and discussions that James Hillman had carried on. And one of the things that really struck me was when he would be interviewed by students, like students on a student radio show would interview James Hillman. And he, it was clear that he was digging it, Yeah. And this was this young energy coming at him, asking him all these hard questions about the future and about, the society. But he had this way of saying, if there's one thing that you take from this, it's. And so now I want to ask you, Dick, if there's one thing we should take from the life of James Hillman and his work, could you boil that down to just one thing?
Oh, wow. Well, I think it comes back to the soul and his efforts to describe the importance of the soul in life and move us beyond, the materialism that has dominated our society, and dig deep and examine how we can be effective in the world. His psychology was really, he did a marvelous talk in Italy in the early 1980s called Anima Mundi, Soul in the World. And his belief strongly was that therapy has got to move out of the consulting room, beyond just, how your mother or your father treated you and or your wife or whatever, and really look at what needs to be done in terms of what you could offer to make a better world for our kids and our grandkids. And I think he was devoted to that through his entire life. And it was real. It was down to earth. He was an ecologist. He planted trees. He gardened. He did all these, things with his hands besides writing. And I think was, along with Jung and Freud, one of the pioneers, the great men in psychology and the history of psychology, and very unrecognized. And I hope that my biography opens doors for people to read his work and know more about him as they go, and realize what an amazing person and thinker he was.
Thank you, Dick. I've been really excited to have you on Jung in the World to do exactly that, to open people up to the work of James Hillman. And your biography is fascinating. There's a lot in there about Jung's work and Jungian theory, as well as Hillman's treatment of that work. So there's a lot to learn in there. It's a treasure trove, actually. So it's been a delight to have you on the show.
Patricia, thank you so much for having me, and hope to do it again.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above: Barbara Anand, Uni Alka, April Barrett, Arlo Compan, Judith Cooper, Lorna Crowell, David Dalrymple, Kevin Davis, Dr. Peter DeMuth, Mary Doherty, Christine Foskett, Britta W. Jacobson, Mary Ann Johnson, Mary W. Liebman, Mona Manning, Patricia Martin, Boris Matthews, Henning McKee, Sue Rosenthal, David O. Stats, Lawrence C. Tingley, Don Troyer, Robert Ulrich, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, William Wolfe, and Ellen Young. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.